John McMullen here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. And John, obviously Trayvon Hester, no one even really knows this guy's even on the team.
Come on, you don't pay attention. I've mentioned Trayvon before.
I have too.
He's been actually quite the pickup because he's been that interior.
I didn't know he was on the team. I said a lot of people might not know he's on the team.
Yeah, he's played pretty well in a reserve role, and obviously when Tim Jernigan was out and even Haloti Ngata, he was sort of the guy that stepped up and has played pretty well, obviously in limited reps, but now he'll forever go down in Eagles lore. They'll probably remember that name now.
No question. Crevon LeBlanc with a huge game and a big play in that game that a lot of people are still talking about today, because that play really, the Bears, if that play is converted and they end up giving them the ball at that spot, they could take a couple shots at the end zone there.
Yeah, you're talking about the LeBlanc play?
Yeah.
That was, the most interesting thing about that to me was Terry McAuliffe had no idea what the rule was. And he's only been a referee in this league for 20 years. People, and I make light of it, but it just tells you how over-legislated this league is. It's absurd. But that ended up being a big, big break, depending on how you look at it. I mean, if the Eagles were aware, it would have been a turnover because the only people in position to pick up the fumble would have been Eagles defenders or the receiver himself, and the receiver wasn't going to get it. But if the Bears were aware and they picked up the football before the referee did, it would have been a complete pass and they would have had an opportunity to score. So it depends the way you look at it, but it turned out to be a big break for the Eagles.
Let me ask you, John, a lot of breakdown this week, and some people thought that the Eagles, I think you had them winning, I had them winning. It seemed like a lot of people thought, I remember listening to Mosher, McMullen, and Krause, and you guys were breaking down the game, and Krause said, how are the Bears favored in this game with all the stuff? Ultimately, in the end, why were the Eagles the better team on Sunday?
I finally got a game perfect. It only took me 18 weeks. This, to me, shaped up, and it really came out exactly as I thought it would, and that is the Eagles' offensive line being a strength and being able to block the Bears' front at least competently, and then they would be able to make at least some plays in the passing game. Did not think they could run the ball at all against that team. Turns out they couldn't. But they were able to pass block them, and they were able to make plays in the passing game. Arguably should have put up more points. The one Nick Foles interception in the end zone was as bad a throw as you're going to make in that type of situation. Hey, they completely outplayed the Bears in the first half, and they left a lot on the field. Second half, Chicago played better. They should have sort of found something with that double move on Avonte Maddox, and that's what they are. I talked about this with Eitan on the Countdown to Kickoff show. Very repetitive. When something works, they're going to go back to it again and again and again because the quarterback can't do a lot. So I was a little disappointed in Avonte Maddox in the second half, and I think part of it was because he had such success in the first half, and he almost picked them off twice. And he got a little greedy, and I think that cost the Eagles defensively. Otherwise, they were solid, other than those double moves in the second half.
John, do you think that's a great way to just transition real quick as we'll look all week, I know, into New Orleans, but just the benefit of the short season, is that something you expect to see a lot if, in fact, the Eagles beat New Orleans, move on, where, okay, maybe this is like a smaller version of Jalen Mills?
Well, I don't know. It's tough to say because you have to learn from your mistakes, and that's one of the things. If you kind of put that in your back pocket and say, okay, you got me. I was a little greedy, and he realizes it, and he learns from his mistakes. he seems to be a very intelligent player, seems to have a high football IQ. So the hope is he learns from it and you don't see the constant same mistake, same mistake, same mistake. I think people are a little disappointed because how well he played outside to that point. I mean, he's been the difference maker as far as cornerback when he came back from the injury and they put him on the outside. Through the first half of that game, he's been a tremendous player, and then they kind of found something with Allen Robinson. Second part is Robinson's a really good route runner too, so you don't see that necessarily every week, and that I wouldn't harp on it. I think the hope, and I'm sure Jim Schwartz will be drilling him on it this week, and he is a rookie player, so I think you'll see improvement.
John, we saw this last year with the bounce of the ball going the way of the Eagles in that Falcons game, and I feel like all year it felt like this was the opposite. Oh, bounces and close games aren't going their way. Well, you've got 2 straight weeks in which a whole hell of a lot has gone their way outside of their control. Parkey and the block deflected kick before that, Kirk Cousins melting down. This is the type of stuff that happens when you look at teams that make runs. They get breaks, things happen outside of their control that go their way. It's almost like Bill Belichick has made a living controlling that fate up there in New England.
Yeah, I mean, you start thinking about it and you start talking about intangible stuff and you start talking about destiny and words like that. I don't know if I necessarily agree with any of that.
Words.
but I mean, people start talking, and maybe if you beat New Orleans, then that starts to really ramp up that train, because then it becomes a situation where you're in the NFC Championship game. You're probably going to be in against a team you've already beaten in the Rams, and if the Cowboys upset them, it would be an even easier road in theory. So I think a lot of it hinges on this game, and this is the one game where you look at and say this is probably one you can't win, because it's a dominant team at home. They're not going to get beat 48-7 again. It's going to be a much tighter affair, I think, but that's a really difficult place to play. So I think all those questions are put off. If they can get this upset, then you start talking about the ball bouncing your way and things, the football gods shining down on you. But I think you got to beat Drew Brees and the Saints first.
John, we've had a lot of discussions about the Golden Tate trade and how it was a failure. People were frustrated at the coaching staff, at the trade, and, from top to bottom about where's Golden Tate. But I think today, after last night's game, we may have found him. So what are your thoughts on his game and, obviously his go-ahead touchdown and his performance?
Well, he's a good player. I think the issue has been the Eagles' inability to fit him into this offense, and part of that is they shifted, sort of played more 2 tight ends, 12 personnel, and yesterday, for whatever reason, game plan purposes, they played more 11, so he got more time on the field. And when he gets more time on the field, you tend to find him. He tends to produce. He's produced in this league for a very, very long time. So I think the issues have been more with the coaching staff and trying to fit him into what they want to do. But the fact that they used him on that 4th down it tells you what they think of him as a player. I don't know ultimately if the trade is worth it. Everybody's obviously going to say that. That's one play. He gave up a 3rd-round pick. I don't think he's going to be here next year. So after you get down off the emotional high of it, I'm not sure the trade was worth it, but that doesn't mean Golden Tate isn't a good player. I just think this coaching staff has had difficulty fitting him in.
The other player who got a touchdown, Dallas Goddard, we've had a lot of good discussion about him throughout the year. Is he being used enough? Blah, blah, blah. He seems to be picking up steam and being incorporated more as the season goes on. Insert him into the wild card round of the playoffs, and he had a couple big plays. I loved the double screen fake where he releases and goes up the middle.
Was a great play.
That was a really good play, and then obviously a big touchdown, the first one on the board. Talk a little bit about Goddard.
Well, he's a good player, and that's, part of the yin and yang, and because they've tried to get him on the field more, as the reason Golden Tate hasn't played as much as people expected. So you can only have a certain number of receivers on the field. If you go with 2 tight ends, you're only going to have 2 receivers out there, and if you go with 3 receivers, only Zach Ertz is going to be out there. So it's kind of, who do you want out there, Dallas Goddard or Golden Tate? And you go about it in a game plan specific way, and that's how the Eagles have been doing it. That's how they'll continue to do it. It'll be interesting, but I think long term, you have to start thinking about, should this offense be sort of what New England once was when they had Gronk and before Aaron Hernandez went off the rails in his personal life? You start to think about, can they have that type of 2 tight end offense rather than the typical 11 personnel that so many teams in this league run and Doug Peterson prefers? If your second tight end is better than your third receiver, I think you should probably start to think about doing that.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. Ultimately, the Eagles' defense played a great game. I thought Bradham had a big role in that game. I mean, Trubisky, I thought he played – you mentioned it. If he throws for over 300, they probably lose the game. I thought he played pretty well in the second half. I thought in the first half he was awful and really held them back, but I thought he played pretty well in the second half. Ultimately, though, I thought the Eagles' defense is a big difference maker in this game. And now, some of that has to do with the Bears' ineptitude on offense. And I thought Nagy had a poor game plan.
Yeah, I thought Nagy had a real poor game plan. You didn't see all the pre-snap motion that they use against everybody else, and I was kind of questioning that myself, where it was, and if it was maybe Matt thinking that Doug knew him too much because they've been together for so long, and he got away from what he does best. I don't think that obviously they didn't get the football to Tariq Cohen as much as they should have, and part of that is because of Jim Schwartz and what the defense did. The Eagles played their big nickel package for the majority of the game, and they had Malcolm Jenkins playing linebacker. That was directly to stop Tariq Cohen, and they were able to do it. But I think at some point you got to test them and say, okay, if they're going to play that, we're going to do this. I didn't see many adjustments from Matt Nagy. I didn't see much innovation, and that's what he's sort of been championed for. And maybe it was just a first-time playoff coach jitters, because he was every bit as jittery as Mitchell Trubisky. And that's kind of why I think most of us, or a lot of us, picked the Eagles. First-time coach, first-time quarterback. Going to be a learning curve, and I think you saw that.
John, I think when you look at the learning curve with the Bears that you laid out, now it gets a little bit more difficult moving forward, but without even looking at the matchup ahead, I still think that there is something about Nick Foles and this offense that we've seen just remain inspired, and I think that what's happened is talent is starting to pick up with it, if that makes sense, where the offensive line clearly playing different than it did in the beginning of the year with the same quarterback, mind you, running it. Do you think it's an under-discussed point that the time and when we've got 2 straight years of Nick Foles taking over this team where everybody around him has hit their full stride?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to give Nick credit for playing well.
Oh, no. I did not mean to take anything away from Nick Foles.
Yeah, I know.
I just meant that
you.
Okay. Well, last time you did, so.
The second part is I think the offensive line is getting healthier. I mean, Lane Johnson struggled through an ankle injury, a knee injury. Wasn't himself. Now he looks like the lights-out best right tackle in football again. Jason Kelsey struggled with a knee injury and elbow injury. Now he looks like the best center in football again. Brandon Brooks, Jason Peters, you put a challenge in front of that guy. He's 36 years old. Khalil Mack is supposed to embarrass him, he shuts him out. That offensive line is good. So that's number one, and they're healthier. And then the second part is getting Darren Sproles back. And in Chicago, but having him in the game for a number of reasons improves that offense. First of all, he can do everything, so you don't sort of tip off what you want to do. He can run the football. He can catch it out of the backfield. He's the best pass protector as far as the running backs go. And I've talked about it with Mike a lot. If the Eagles did make it to the playoffs and they got in the big situations, you're going to see more and more Darren Sproles if he's healthy, and that's exactly what's happening. He's a big part of that offense. And then you have sort of the realization that maybe Dallas Goddard is the best way to go, maybe playing 12 personnel until this game against Chicago when they shifted back to Golden Tate. So they've improved from a personnel standpoint at receiver, whether you're talking about the receivers, the actual wideouts, and the tight ends. It's all come together, and Nick's a big part of it in situational football, because if you look at their third and fourth down numbers since that Rams game, they're unbelievable. And that part, I think Nick deserves a lot of credit for.
We've talked about this earlier in the show. Some people may not have been listening back then, but we'll ask you, John, about why the Leblanc play was reviewed in the first place. Why were they allowed to review a play that was deemed to be incomplete?
Why were they allowed to review it?
People keep asking. We discussed this way earlier in the show, but people keep texting in. Why were they able to review that play? The officials called an incomplete pass, correct?
Yes, they called an incomplete pass.
Right.
Now, I'm thinking, I don't have the play-by-play. What was the timing of the game?
On the LeBlanc play? It was late in the first.
It was late in the second
half.
Yeah, late in the second quarter. I want to say it was around the 4-minute mark.
Yeah.
They scored on that drive anyway.
They kicked a field goal.
Yep.
Yeah, they kicked a field goal, went back. Somebody challenged the play.
They called the Bears called timeout.
No, I think it was official review.
The Bears called timeout because they wanted the officials to be able to take a longer look at the play, is what happened.
Well, yeah, they didn't realize.
So somebody had to challenge the play. I don't recall exactly what. It's not inside 2 minutes. It's not a turnover. So the officials can't review the play on their own.
So this is the play-by-play says Trubisky pass incomplete, deep right to Miller, broken up by LeBlanc. The replay official reviewed the incomplete pass ruling, and the play was upheld. There was 36 seconds left in the half.
Yeah, that's under 2 minutes.
Okay.
Under 2 minutes and a half, then it is all official.
Okay. Right. Well, people are going bonkers like this is like some conspiracy. It was under 2 minutes. We talked about it earlier in the show, and unfortunately, you missed that part of the show. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, under 2 minutes, because they try to take anything of, the coaches don't want that responsibility inside 2 minutes, so they took that away. And they can review anything inside of 2 minutes. What I got caught up in, and that's what I was saying before, is just the utter astonishment that Terry McAuley didn't understand the rule.
3 Super Bowls.
And he's been a referee in that league for 20 years before he retired, and he had no idea what the rule was.
Yeah.
And it kind of that highlights part of the problem in the fact that somebody could be a referee for 20 years and not know the rule because the rules are absurd. And I've always argued that the fact that people like Terry McAuley and Dean Blandino and Mike Pereira exist, in other words, you have these rules analysts on these telecasts. Think about it.
But the crazy part is, John,
baseball,
the crazy part is, John, you could put 4 of those guys on the telecast, and they might have 4 different answers.
Yeah, which tells you. And I always say Dean was the best, Dean Blandino, because when he was running this league's replay, reviews, they were so consistent. You might have hated it. You might have hated the calls. You might have hated the rules. But, man, when they showed a play, I knew what he was going to rule because he was incredibly consistent. That's all you can ask for. And they have not had that same kind of consistency since Al Riveron took over for Dean Blandino. I think that's the bigger issue. Now, overall, the league is a mess because it's over-legislated, but that's another story.
Yeah. Well, guess what? Eagles-Saints this week. We'll dive into that. Last time the Saints played a meaningful football game, it was before Christmas.
Yeah, I mean, they're really good, but again, you can throw that 48-7 game out. That will forever be the Chandon, Sullivan, Devontae Ballsby game. Those guys aren't going to play. But it is a difficult matchup. Whereas this week I said styles matched up really, really well. Styles don't match up well against the Saints because the secondary, it's improved from Ballsby and Sullivan, but it's still not good. And all of a sudden you got Drew Brees, so it's much more difficult.
All right, we'll have plenty more on that game all week long right here with John McMullen this time tomorrow. Appreciate it, pal.
Hey, thanks, guys.